Hey, it's Skillen from Winnipeg Nightly Arts. I just wanted to talk a little bit about Fuhlen Indes and how to fight from the bind. Fuhlen and Indes are best understood as two halves of the OODA loop, which stands for observe, orient, decide, and act, with Fuhlen being the equivalent of observe and orient, and Indes being decision and action. And we have to use Fuhlen in order to decide on what we need to do. That's kind of what fighting from the bind is all about. It allows you to do this because once you have contact with the other person's sword, you can actually feel what they're doing, which oftentimes gives you much better information than you would have if you're just going off of your eyes alone. In fact, the Duchwechseln is by far the most dangerous part of the fight, the part before you establish contact or before you establish a bind. A bind being just any time that your sword touches the opponent's sword. So I'm going to go through some scenarios that are common to the bind and how to deal with them. How Ringek tells us we should handle these scenarios. And I'm going to give a little bit of insight onto how to congeal this into hopefully a cohesive system. So this is a bind. Anytime your swords come into contact, right now we're mid on mid. The first thing that you should always do is just attempt a direct in attack. It can be a cut, it can be a thrust. That's largely range dependent. It doesn't especially matter. You want to do this automatically almost, but you don't want to do this with heavy dedication. You don't want to force this. You want your hands to be like relatively relaxed when doing this, and mostly what you're doing is you're just feeling if the opponent is soft in the bind. It's kind of an active probing rather than forcing it through. And if you just feel that your sword is going to go through, you just continue with it. So the next scenario is if the opponent displaces you. You just want to cut over. Normally, we don't want to cut over because that's a slow action and we can get punished for it. However, if the opponent displaces to the side, you're not really cutting around. You're not doing free abnehmen. You're doing what's called Zucken, twitching, which is you just wrench your sword straight back and straight down on the same line, oftentimes with a step off to your left if you're in a right-handed bind. And then you just cut to them, and from here you can either step out or you can crash in. The other scenario is if they cut around. I'll just show that again. And if they cut around, you let them move 90% of the way, and this way you don't have to cut around their sword. And then from here, you just cut directly in on them. So it's a very minimal, the movement is very minimal because the opponent's moving around your sword. They're doing 90% of the work, and you're just cutting straight into them. It's different than the one where they're pressing you to the side, where their sword is actually going away from you and isn't presenting an immediate threat, which gives you enough time to just cut straight back and down on them. So here's just another angle of these options, right? Doing the initial attack, right? You can do it either as a cut like this, or you can do it, here Jonah displaces me, but you can do it as a thrust like this. And from here, if you do that, this is how you kind of move into it. So from here, you can see that I start to do my attack. I feel that I'm displaced, and I let him go to the side and just cut straight down. And that's all it is. And in this case, I had to move in. I would probably crash in, as I show many other times, just shoving my hands onto his hands to pin his sword down. Or you can step hard off to the left, or you can step backwards into the left, whatever you want. Yeah, here's the pin. And then so here's just another angle of if your opponent wants to cut around, you kind of threaten them to see if they want to cut around. And then from here, I don't move nearly as much as my opponent, and I just go straight in. and you just attack. And again, I pin the arms. I like to pin them down in this scenario just because it means that they can't attack you. There is another kind of displacement that the opponent can do, which requires a little bit of a unique reaction. It's not substantially different. All of our actions are... The core movement tends to overlap with several options, which makes it fairly user-friendly. And this is when the opponent displaces you downwards. What you want to do is you want to wind up, and you want to essentially pull your sword free from their bind, and you cut upwards into their chin and complete it with a thrust. And this is called the Duchwechseln. So from here, I just wind up and I let my sword go free. And oftentimes, if you start your initial attack, you'll feel that doesn't work, and you'll feel them starting to go sideways, and you'll try to go over, and you feel that doesn't work. You just kind of flow into this movement. So you're always wanting to do... You always want your decisions to flow almost sequentially so that you can do the initial thing. If that doesn't work, then you have a fallback, and you have a fallback, and you have a fallback. You want this to be as straightforward as possible so that it's as easy as possible to deal with. Although fighting from the bind is quite technical, and it is quite difficult, and you have to practice it a lot. So I'm just saying you want to make sure you're simplifying it as much as possible, because it's already challenging. There's another variation of cutting around that requires special attention too, and that's when your opponent cuts a Zwerchau around. Technically, it is possible to catch them on the arms when they're attempting to cut around. You can prevent them from cutting around entirely, and there is a emergency kind of displacement technique that you can do against this, but the technique that is the most consistent is to cut a Zwerch under their Zwerch. So from here, I'm just showing Jonah to cut the Zwerchau. And oftentimes you'll end up, if you try to just parry this to the side, there's a good chance that they'll hit you if they have like good positioning. So we don't really want to do this. And even if you parry wide, if you displace wide like I showed, it leaves you open to several attacks. And this is a sequence that I really like. As the attacker, I really like when my opponent displaces my Zwerch wide, because it gives me a huge plethora of offensive options. So on the defense, you don't want this to happen. You don't want to get into that scenario. Oftentimes, prevention is the best solution. So if you just try to press in, oftentimes you get hit below as well. So here's what I actually recommend. As he's cutting around, you do its smaller Zwerch under. This is the same principle as defeating your opponent who's cutting around, who's freely cutting around with a direct cut in. It's a form of Nachreisen. Which reminds me, there's another variation that can occur here that I didn't film, and that's just where your opponent pulls the sword back into some kind of a guard. It's almost the same as when they're cutting around. They're both dealt with by Nachreisen or following after, and in that case you just stab them in the face or cut them to the head, as I already showed with the soft bind. It's very similar. The only difference is that their sword is going back towards their head, and you just prevent them. Anyways, this is how we deal with the Zwerchau. From here, the opponent leaves the bind and they start to cut around. You want to cut to the same side below. You have to move a little bit less, and the main thing is to keep your sword underneath their sword. This is effectively keeping you in a bind on the right, so that if both of you straighten your arms out, your sword will be on the right. You're not letting the opponent get around this way. So you can cut in like this, and your sword forms a barrier between you and them. And then you can crash in, pin the arms, etc. And if need be, you can follow up with further cuts. Here's another angle to it. So it's important that as soon as you feel your opponent starting to do this, you'll have what I like to call a oh shit moment, where you realize that something different than all of the other scenarios has happened, and it doesn't feel like anything else. And oftentimes, the way that I experience it is it feels like, oh shit, I'm about to get hit in the head in an undefended manner, and I just kind of do this reactively in order to shut this line of attack off. So here's a counter for when the opponent feels that you're soft in the bind and they attempt to just go for a thrust. The first thing that I recommend that somebody do, and this is specifically useful when both of you are in the bind and you're kind of feeling each other out. What happens is they are going to look for a thrust or a cut, and this counters both of those. And what you want to do is a counter thrust, essentially an Absetzen, but from the bind. And here's how it works. They begin to move, and you just wind up into your right as you thrust forward. Or importantly, you thrust forward and your hands unfurl into the upper left position. I like to have my long edge up just because it creates this little pocket between my crossguard and the strung of my blade, where the opponent will just kind of get stuck in there, and it protects you pretty well. The important thing, though, is that the further your hands are forward, the less they need to go to the side. You want your hands to be traveling forward this entire time. You don't want them to be going back and pulling to your side. You just want to shoot forward and wind. And ideally, your tip should be hitting the opponent either just before or just as they make contact with your crossguard. So this one I was trying to demonstrate it a little bit slower, and it was a little sloppier. I almost did more of a Zwerchau movement where your point stays high longer. Ideally, when you're doing this, the point shoots directly into the opponent's chest or throat, and you don't want to snap downwards like I did, but you know, sometimes that stuff happens when you're doing demonstrations. So now we're just working on this as a drill. I'll just comment on it when interesting things come up. So what I'm doing is just giving Jonah enough pressure that he has to kind of work through the scenario, but I'm trying not to overwhelm him. You want about an 80%, it's like 80 to 85% success rate. Oh, I'm just kind of showing him how to wind up and free his point at that point. But yeah, you want an 80 to 85% success rate when doing practice in order to have optimal results. In order for your partner to learn, or your student to learn as efficiently as possible. So he's starting to get it here. It's starting to get much better. Keeping control over the center is the main thing he needed to work on at that point, but so I'm telling him to use that initial attack from the bind to force me to react. And he cuts around here. I noticed that it's a bit bigger. That was actually not bad. I noticed that his Zucken was like a bigger... Oh yeah, I'm just showing how to attack, and you don't want there to be a delay between the bind and your follow-up attack. And if there was nothing there, it should just look like this. Just going over the Zucken a little bit. And what happens if somebody pauses, you just cut to them. And again, you can just cut to them if they don't displace you or if they don't do anything. Yeah, just explaining when the opponent cuts around, you do the initial action and you feel what's happening and you react from there. So he's starting to get it. There we go. So there his cut was just a little too big and going around, and I didn't actually give him the proper opening, so I just kind of stopped him from being able to cut directly to me. Here I'm just explaining how to do the cut around a little bit more efficiently. And see, he's still doing a right Oberhaut to a left Oberhaut, so I'm just trying to help him feel the difference between them. And there we go. I find that's quite useful to just actually like kind of pilot the student's sword in order to when they don't understand the distinction you're making. There we go. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'm explaining that he needs to have his arms more forward in order to, before he steps, because he's tending to, you want your arms about 90 to 95% extended before you start to step. If they're 100% locked out, then you won't have any give if you do end up stepping through and thrusting. So you want a little bit of give, but you do need to get them a little bit more out. And there we go. And it starts to open up his attacks a lot more. He has better follow-up options. And he's not too close. Yeah. So now I shift to focusing on the Zwerch. So I've been mixing in different options, right, of varying complexity and helping him refine his decision-making tree. I mean, ideally, it's a decision-making stick or like a decision-making fork, but it takes practice and it takes directed drilling in order to kind of build that up. So you need to work on the individual thing, and then you need to add it into the context of all of the techniques, and you need to help the opponent organize that into a mental schema. So that's kind of what we were doing there.